Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Political Institutions and Political Economy Workshop at the Bedrosian Center at the University of Southern California. I'm Jeff Jenkins. I run the workshop, and today our speaker is Melissa Lee. Melissa is Assistant Professor of Politics and International Affairs at the Department of Politics at Princeton and the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Melissa studies the international and domestic politics of state building and state capacity. Much of her work examines how external actors disrupt political order and shape the development of the state. Her research interests also include the historical and domestic origins of state capacity and the politics of territorial change. She is the author of Crippling Leviathan: How Foreign Subversion Weakens the State, came out this year at Cornell University Press. Research has also been published or is forthcoming in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and International Organization. And her policy writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs. Her work has received the American Political Science Association's 2016 Helen Dwight Reed Award and Perry Worldhouse's Emerging Scholar Global Policy Prize. Melissa received her PhD in political science from Stanford University and her BA in political science from the University of California, San Diego. Before turning it over to Melissa, I want to just say quickly to the audience members, if you have a question, you could type it into the chat box. You could raise your hand and I'll make sure that I look around and see you. Or you could quietly break in if it's a question that's really on topic. But aside from that, I think we're ready to go, and we'll move it over to Melissa. And Melissa tells me this is very early work, so you're getting some early eyes on some work today.
Great, thank you for the introduction, Jeff. And thank you everyone for taking some time off from checking the election returns to hear about this new project. It's brand new work with my co-author Nan Zhang, who is a senior research scholar at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods in Bonn. And, it's so new that today is the first time it's being presented. So it's really timely. We're really looking forward to the feedback. And as Jeff mentioned, a lot of my work examines the domestic and historical origins of state development. And this project is very much a part of that line of research. It begins with this observation that the centralization of authority is a key aspect of state building that has both institutional and ideational components, right? What makes a state is not simply whether it has a set of differentiated bureaucratic institutions or a defined piece of territory with borders, but whether those the state purports to govern actually think of the state as sovereign and acknowledge the state's sovereignty. Now, existing theories in the state and nation building literatures have explained this fundamental component of state building by emphasizing processes of political and economic modernization. However, despite the influence of this strand of scholarship, modernization arguments are difficult to test because the historical processes in question predate the advent of data on the popular imagination of sovereignty, such as public opinion data, for example. And so in our paper, we surmount this problem by studying state building and political centralization in the context of 19th century America. As we all know, this was a period of significant political transformation in which the United States stopped being a union of co-equal sovereign entities and instead became a single nation. This transformation was institutional, and it was also ideational in the sense that Americans changed how they understood US sovereignty, right? How they understood the sovereignty of the United States. And this evolution in thinking about sovereignty is evident in a well-documented grammatical change in which the phrase United States goes from being a plural noun to being a singular noun. So in other words, whereas at the beginning of the 19th century, Americans said the United States are, by the close of the century, they were much more likely to say the United States is. And so Nan and I examined this is-are shift over the latter half of the 19th century using congressional speech data from the 32nd through the 73rd Congresses as a window into imagined sovereignty. And we ask a simple question, which is what explains this variation in how Americans imagined US sovereignty? The United States has a number of features that I think make it a really excellent case for the study of state building. From a theoretical standpoint, what I really like about it is that there is a clear alternative to the idea of a single national entity, which is the continued sovereignty of the US states, right? So in contrast to the European experience, from which most of our state building theories are derived, this is not a place where the alternative is religious authority or these very hyper local authorities. This is the continuation of existing sovereignties of the US states. And so I like that feature about it. But importantly, from an empirical standpoint, the US is a very data-rich environment, even during the time in which we would now probably call it a developing country if we were using contemporary terms, right? And so our study joins other recent work that draws on and takes advantage of data availability to study historical state building and democratization processes. Our data allows us to link speech, and to link is our usage, to specific individuals, right? Which then lets us investigate characteristics related to an individual's background and life experiences and environment, and to see how these characteristics shape the way they think about US sovereignty. Right? And taken together, these 2 points allow us to address a thorny problem in the state and nationalism literatures, which is that sort of national identity develops, or nationalism develops in the 19th century before individual level measures of national sentiment existed. And so the results I'm going to show you today are preliminary, and they're surprising. They're preliminary because we're still in data collection. And they're surprising because they provide no evidence for the conventional wisdoms on modernization, and they challenge well-known narratives about the effect of the Civil War. So what are these conventional wisdoms? The economic and political modernization arguments come in several variants. One strand, which I think is most embodied by the work of Ernst Gellner, argues that urbanization and industrialization broke parochial ties, local ties, and paved the way for identification of the state as individuals transitioned from an agricultural economy to a city-based industrial economy. Another strand is closely associated with the work of Anderson, but also Lauren in the US context, and this emphasizes the transformative power of print capitalism, right? This idea that when we have print capitalism, it makes possible connections via printed materials, which then allows individuals to imagine a community beyond the locality. In contrast, arguments about infrastructure and connectedness, as well as contact and exposure to stateness, emphasize and stress the importance of encounters with the central authorities and the apparatus of the state, and the importance of these encounters in bringing the state in contact with local life in ways never before, right? So this political modernization process. What I think all of these arguments share is an assumption that local ties have to be weakened or broken in order for citizens to identify with the nation or accept the state's sovereign authority. In contrast, a different approach in the literature has emphasized biographical features, life experiences that correspond to things like military service, particularly military service in a war against an external enemy, but also sort of the experience of immigrating to a new country. The US case also points to a third approach, which is the consequences of the US Civil War for state and nation building, right? So the APD literature advances 2 different arguments about the effects of the Civil War. The first is the well-known argument about sectional differences in the institution of slavery, right? So fearing that the North would use federal power against their interests, the Southern states advocated the doctrine of states' rights, which held that sovereignty ultimately lay with the states themselves and not the federal government. And so the idea here is basically the Confederacy's defeat delegitimized states' rights and led to a triumph of the single national identity, which would then, I think, in our data show up as a greater usage of the singular. The second argument, I think, is closely aligns with the state and the war-making, state-making literature, this Bellicist literature. And here in this literature, it emphasizes the sort of exigencies of war and the effects on the expansion of the federal government, right? To be able to fight the war and defeat the Confederacy, the North had to create new institutions, it had to conscript individuals for military service. And so this massive expansion of the state, as well as the effects of Reconstruction, resulted in bringing Americans into close contact with the federal government and with central power, right? Both of these arguments point to the same conclusion, which is that the Civil War should have eroded the idea of multiple sovereignties or separate state sovereignties, and then transformed the US into a single sovereign entity. But sovereignty is ultimately ideational, right? And that final sovereign authority exists when people think it exists. And so one way to get some leverage on how people think about and understand sovereignty is to examine the shared civic language, so how people are talking about sovereignty, right? We take language as it's sort of consistently with my other work, we take language as a way to understand the popular imagination. Now, historians and literary scholars have documented an important change in language, in the shared civic language. This is the shift from the US as a plural noun to the US as the singular noun. This shift took place over the course of the 19th century, coinciding with significant transformation and the US Civil War. And many historians actually attribute this shift to the Civil War, right? So much in line with this like broader state building literature. The idea of the Civil War being decisive in settling the question of the singular versus the plural was articulated as early as 1887. The Washington Post observed that there was a time a few years ago when the United States was spoken of in plural number. Men said the United States are, but the war changed all of that. The sabers of Sheridan, the muskets of Sherman, the artillery of Grant, the surrender of Mr. Davis and General Lee meant a transition from the plural to the singular. Right? So this idea that the war changed everything was this transformative juncture. This emerged early, and a lot of historians have argued similarly that the war had this effect. However, recent scholarship has challenged this narrative and instead have pointed to a much more gradual process of change that's consistent with the modernization explanations and not the transformative juncture explanation. So for example, in a comprehensive review of all Supreme Court opinions from 1790 to 1919, Minor Myers documents the increase in the singular usage and shows that it rose surprisingly slowly throughout the 19th century. We do see this little increase in the 1860s, but the rapid change doesn't occur into 1890. Similar work in the digital humanities corroborates this story using newspaper data, which provides a much larger and non-elite sample of speech. And again, I think this evidence is suggestive of the slower, gradual shift that would occur alongside modernization. Now, while both studies are showing national trends, they don't investigate regional or individual level variation. And this individual level variation or regional level variation is important because the level and the pace of economic and political transformation and modernization varied throughout the United States. And so these studies lack individual data, which are really important, I think, for helping us understand how individuals imagine sovereignty. And so this is what our paper does. We take up this challenge. We study congressional speech as a lens to understand the evolution of sovereignty. We don't claim, of course, that Congress members are a random sample of the US population, but we do rely on the diversity within this set of individuals and this idea that supposedly they are reflective of public sentiments and interests, but we don't claim they're a random sample. We are going to conduct two analyses to assess the arguments about modernization as well as the Civil War. The first is a regional level analysis in which we model singular usage as a function of sectional characteristics. And then we turn to an individual level analysis in which we model singular usage as a function of contextual characteristics related to an individual's birthplace, as well as their contemporaneous constituency, as well as key biographical characteristics. We create our dependent variable is the use of the singular or the plural. And so we code a binary measure of singular usage at the level of the speech. So sometimes I call this just the speech and sometimes I call it the speaker statement, but what I'm referring to is a block of speech spoken by an individual. Our speech data come from the Congressional Globe and the Congressional Record, which contain the debates and proceedings of Congress. Our sample includes speeches covering the period 1851 up to 1914, corresponding to the 32nd up to the 63rd Congresses. I misspoke earlier when I said 73, so I apologize for that. Our choice of start date, which is 1851, reflects an important data consideration, which is that prior to 1851, the Congressional Globe was not a verbatim transcription of the debates of Congress. And because our project investigates speech, and links that speech to particular individuals, it's essential that speech be verbatim, right? These be verbatim transcriptions. Now, the Constitution actually requires that each house keep a journal of its proceedings, but it didn't actually specify how. And so the Globe, like the other journals that were founded to report the proceedings of Congress, was initially a privately run publication, or was a privately run publication. It reported summaries rather than verbatim transcriptions, and in its early years, it was a partisan publication. And so it had a partisan audience. But several developments in the 1840s combined to transform the Globe into a nonpartisan professional publication with verbatim transcription. An important set of technological developments made this possible. So first was the advent of the Pitman system of stenography, which increased the speed and accuracy of transcription, right? And that in doing so lowered the cost. So there was a big technological barrier to verbatim transcription. And this particular system of stenography reduced that barrier. In addition, the invention of the telegraph a few years later increased the readership for these privately run journals, and especially the Globe, and this created pressure to deliver accurate reports of the proceedings. The Senate and the House also passed some measures that would also contribute to verbatim transcription. So both houses required their members to subscribe to a journal of the proceedings of Congress, and the Globe was very popular, and so many members subscribed to the Globe. And the fact that members from different parties, both parties, were subscribing to the Globe provided steady income to the Globe that then reduced the benefits of pandering to one party or another, right? If it would reduce its partisanship, it would get more members to subscribe to it. In addition, both houses eventually put the reporters on the public payroll and required impartial reporting. And so these developments combined to make the Globe a verbatim account as of 1851. So we throw out everything before 1851. It has the unfortunate effect of lopping off, some pre-war observations, but we can't include those because they're not verbatim, and we couldn't separate out whether or not usage would be attributed to the reporter versus the speaker. But as of 1851, we can be quite confident, based on our own analyses of the secondary literature, that the Globe is verbatim. And the Record, which is the successor publication, is verbatim as well. We follow existing scholarship in the humanities by identifying singular and plural usage via subject-verb agreement. And so we focus on three verb pairs, which are is, are, has, have, and was, were. Unfortunately, we can't just take the text of the Globe, the OCR text of the Globe and the Record, and do a keyword search for these phrases, the United States is and the United States are. We face two challenges for doing that. The first is that the United States has to be the subject of the sentence and not the object, right? And we also have to exclude constructions such as President of the United States. And so to give you an example of this problem, this statement here says the commissioners who represented the United States are now dead. And so we see in bold, the keyword phrase United States are, but of course here, the United States is not the subject. The subject of the sentence is the commissioners. And so we have to find some way to exclude this kind of construction. The second problem, and this problem I have to say is actually made much harder by the second challenge, which is that the OCR data are uncorrected, or it's called dirty OCR. It's unprocessed. And the result is that the raw texts are variously riddled with typos and symbols and junk. And so you can see an example of this problem in the second statement, which says, what it's supposed to say is the United States has not owned any land in that part of the state of Tennessee since 1806, right? And instead what we see is the United States has. And so there was a great deal of work that had to be done to clean up this language. Nan and I benefited from the assistance of an amazing research assistant. I don't think he's here on the call, Tillman, who basically worked with me through this following workflow to clean up the data and isolate the statements to is, are statements. And so what we did, just to give you a quick overview using the Record as an example, what we did is we read in the full corpus of speeches for our time period of interest. In the case of the Record, this was about 3.2 million statements. A statement, again, being a speaker says something and then another speaker says something. So in that case, that would be two different statements. 3.2 million speeches. We then throw out every speech that does not mention the United States, And this process leaves us with about 188,000 statements, or about 5% of the data. We then went through a process of deleting object mentions and deleting compound subjects, as well as proper nouns. So we deleted object mentions by throwing out any statement in which a preposition precedes the phrase United States. We also deleted any compound subjects such as Mexico and the United States, as well as proper nouns such as Supreme Court of the United States. That left us with about 50,000 statements. We then conducted the is/are search for those 3 keyword pairs, leaving us now with 11,000 statements. That number is way too high because it includes a large number of duplicates and some other problems. And so we threw out those duplicates, cutting down the potential data set to 4,200 statements. And then Tillman went through every single one of those 4,200 statements in the case of the record, and about 2,000 in the case of the Globe, manually cleaned them up, throwing out anything that had still managed to sneak in. Again, the sneak in effect is because the OCR it was kind of a nightmare. And so there's just a limit to what you can do with automatic processing. So he went through, cleaned it up, and our final data set contains 3,700 statements from the record over a 40-year period, and about 1,600 statements from the Globe over a 20-year period, which is about 0.1% of all speaker statements for this set of data. Okay. All of that work was just to code the data for the DV. The explanatory variables were thankfully a bit easier. And so here our task was to associate characteristics related to modernization with specific speakers based on their geographies, some spatial unit. I'm going to get to the spatial unit in just a moment, but let me tell you about the data that we pulled together to operationalize modernization. To measure connectivity, we calculated the density of railroad track for our spatial units. We examined whether the spatial units had a coastline defined as being on the Great Lakes, the Gulf, or one of the oceans. We also calculated a measure of average ruggedness for the area, and these are all based on GIS data. To capture both print capitalism and government contact, because we didn't think we could actually pull that apart with this indicator, we calculate density of post offices. So some scholars have taken post offices to be evidence of print capitalism. Of course, at the time, the federal government basically consists only of the post office, or the post office is the significant part of the US government. And this is part of why we also think it captures government contact. In a minute, I'll tell you why I'm not worried about the fact that these can't be separated in this variable. Half of this data had to be coded manually by our RAs, and the other half we obtained from Acemoglu, Moscona, and Robinson. And then we pulled 2 variables from the US Census to calculate economic modernization, which includes percent urban, as well as the value added by manufacturing. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that we run 2 sets of analyses, one at the regional level and one at the individual level. For the regions, we define the spatial unit as based on the constituency of the speaker, right? So for the representatives, this is really easy. We just take the district that they represent. And for the senators and the at-large representatives, they are assigned to their entire state. For the GIS variables, it's easy to calculate the data for the districts or the states. But for data that were only available at the county level, we had to aggregate up to the district level using a weighted average based on the county's share of district territory. At the individual level, we're interested in contextual characteristics related to both the contemporaneous constituencies, as well as the birthplace locations. And we also want to pull in some biographical data. And so for the constituency level data, we use the same units as defined on the previous slide. For birthplaces, we had to locate where the members of Congress were born. And so we consult the Biographical Directory of Congress, coding the county of birth, or if that information was missing, the town and state of birth. In the case of town and state, we had to map the location of those towns and states to the counties that existed at the time of birth. So we were able to pull location data and check their old counties. In addition, as I mentioned, we pull in a bunch of biographical characteristics, which include immigrant status, military service, a measure of whether or not you're a rebel, so defined as serving in the Confederate Army or in the Confederate government, as well as party ID. In this analysis, speech is our unit of analysis. However, speeches are crossed both in Congresses and in individuals. So one individual can be in multiple Congresses, and each Congress naturally has multiple speakers in it. And so to account for this data structure, we estimate a hierarchical linear probability model with cross-random effects for Congress and individual. We use linear probability rather than logistic probability because linear models are just easier to interpret and produce substantially the same results as logits. And then just to make sure in our robustness checks, we run a bunch of, we reproduce the analyses with logit. Before I show any of those regression results though, I think it's helpful to take a look at some basic patterns in the data. So this plot shows the proportion of speech that is singular for the period 1851 through 1914. The blue line is the Union, so speech from speakers from Union states or the states that became the Union in the war. And then the red lines are the speech of speakers from the states that fought for the Confederacy. The unsurprising part of this plot is that you see this national trend going upward, right? Speech, the singular constitutes about 20% of usage in 1851 and nearly hits the ceiling by 1914. This is consistent with the two figures that I showed earlier from Myers and Santine et al.'s work. And I think this provides some face validity to our approach in capturing speech. The surprising part of this plot pertains to the variation or lack of variation between the regions. Okay, so what we can see is that prior to the Civil War, there are no differences between singular usage in the South versus the North. And what we see after the war, after Reconstruction, I should say, is a divergence in North versus South speech. This is surprising because the states' rights and sectional differences hypothesis would actually predict the opposite, right? What that hypothesis would predict would be divergence before or differences before and convergence after the Civil War, right? This plot here shows the breakdown of singular usage between the North and the South by Congress. The bars show the mean and the lines show the 95% confidence intervals. And the takeaway here is that there is no difference in pre-war North and South patterns. We suspect that what we're observing at least in the South after the war, is some kind of backlash effect. We didn't expect to observe this at all, so we're sort of puzzling through what we're observing, and we think that it could be, this backlash effect that results from the Confederacy's defeat and the North's occupation of the South during Reconstruction. Right? So this figure shows the proportion of former Confederates in Congress, again, soldiers or officials from the Southern state. Proportion of former Confederates among the delegations from the Southern states. What you can see is that their share increases dramatically after 1868 and slowly declining by the end of the century. And so this sort of bump up coincides with that divergence in that previous plot that I showed you a few slides ago. So we formally tested the effect of the Confederacy using regression. We first ran models comparing all Southerners against the baseline category of Northerners, including the cross-random effects that I described before, and then including either a linear time trend or Congress fixed effects. And in both cases, as you can see in this top purple line, we see that being from the South depresses usage of the singular. But in a separate model, we then broke apart the South, right, to distinguish between Confederates and non-Confederate Southerners. And what we see is that the Southern effect seems to be driven entirely by Confederates, these former rebels who are now in Congress. And so to summarize the evidence so far, our results seem to challenge the two sort of conventional wisdoms around it seems to challenge the sectional difference story around the Civil War, right? But there is this other variant of the Civil War story, which is the federal expansion story. And this literature, again, is the one that argues that having to fight the war caused the North to expand federal power. The corollary to the argument, in our case, is that there should be some kind of structural break in singular usage or in Northern imaginations about sovereignty before the war and after the war. But whether we draw that structural break in 1861 or 3 or 5 or 7, our regression models show no statistically significant differences between singular usage in the North before or after in the post-war or pre-war periods. And so while we do know that the Civil War did transform state power in an institutional sense, our evidence does not point to a similar transformation in the popular imagination of US sovereignty, right? So the ideational component is lagging behind the institutional component. The last regional analysis that we conduct looks at the modernization arguments. And so here we're comparing the North versus the West. We look at 3 indicators of modernization: urbanization, railroad density, and post office density. And the plot in the bottom right corner shows the percent or proportion of speech that is singular. And so while the North does lead the West in terms of these modernization indicators, singular usage is actually similar between North and South throughout this latter half of the 19th century. I have to say I was pretty surprised by this result. I was sure we were going to see a difference, and the data are showing us something different, right? And I think this does seem to challenge the modernization arguments. And so far I've showed you just the regional analyses, and now let me turn to our individual level analyses, right? Our granular data permit us to leverage a lot of variation at the individual level. And again, we associate characteristics of the speaker's birthplaces, constituencies, and life experiences with the way that they imagine sovereignty of the United States. But when thinking about the connection between this macro level theory and micro level effects, we focus on 2 processes of change. The first is a cohort replacement effect, in which individuals who imagine the United States as a plural entity pass away, or in our case, exit Congress, and are then replaced in the general population or in Congress by those who think of the US in the singular sense, right? Who think of the US as a single sovereign entity. But the second possible process of change could be a linguistic shift within individuals, in which individuals change how they think about US sovereignty over their lifetimes, and also shift their speech to reflect that ideational shift. Now, as a first cut, we capture the cohort replacement effect by accounting for the year of speech or Congress. And we capture the linguistic shift effect by accounting for the birth year of the speaker. Oh, sorry, reverse of that. I flipped it. Both of these variables behave as you expect, though. The later the speaker is born, the more likely he's going to use the singular. They're all hymns at this time period. And the later the Congress, the more likely he uses the singular, right? But distinguishing between these effects is important. And to see why, consider this example, consider a Congress that has Speaker A at time, who uses the singular 60% of the time in time 1, and then who then leaves, exits Congress, and is replaced in time 2 by a different Congressman B, who uses the singular 80% of the time, right? Suppose also that these 2 Congresses have Congressman C, who uses the singular 60% of the time in time 1, and then shifts his speech such that he uses the singular 80% of the time by time 2. So in the absence of the birth year variable, year of speech would capture both the difference between A and B, as well as the within C difference. And so we have to control for year of birth. But you might still be worried that other things are varying between A and B, right? And you might also be curious to know whether or not the gap between A and B is similar or different to the within gap between C in times 1 and 2. And so to get at those, we're breaking speech, the year of speech variable into its between component and its within component. Think of the within component as basically a fixed effect. What you see here is that the size of the effects are approximately the same. So then, so having done this exercise, now let me show you the results from the full regression. So recall that the full individual level model includes 3 different sets of variables. So at the top are the contemporaneous constituency characteristics. So if this guy's in Congress in 1870, this would be the characteristics of his constituency in 1870. We also include the biographical characteristics in the middle, as well as the birthplace characteristics associated with the county he was located, the county in which he was born at the time of birth. All of the continuous predictors in this model have been standardized to have mean zero. So all the continuous predictors aside from year, which has a natural interpretation, have been standardized to have mean 0 and standard deviation 1. The length of the bars are 95% confidence intervals. And so to make it like nice and clear, we've color coded the significant predictors in red. Again, the evidence doesn't really, there's no evidence here for the modernization arguments, right? We have a bunch of null effects. There's really no evidence for modernization, whether or not we're looking at the contemporaneous constituency variables or the birth level variables. What we do see is something that corroborates our previous analysis, which is that being a rebel has a very powerful negative effect on your speech, depresses the use of the singular. Year of birth and year of speech are, of course, important. And then we have this kind of quirky result where we see that being born on a steamboat navigated river, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that in the previous analysis, but being born on a steamboat navigated river apparently is associated with greater singular usage. Nan and I are kind of baffled by this. We actually think we're sort of inclined to dismiss it as a fluke because none of the other modernization variables are significant. And then we also ran regressions with a bunch of other modernization variables that I haven't talked about. So it's kind of like robustness checks. The null is very robust. And so I'm pretty sure, unless someone has like ideas about what could be going on with River, we're sort of inclined to sort of say this was just, a fluke. All right. So that analysis didn't contain any immigrants because immigrants or Americans born abroad don't have birthplace characteristics from America. And so to look at the effect of immigrants, we ran a second analysis where we throw out the birthplace characteristics, but put the immigrants and Americans born abroad back into the sample. And we look at their speech. And again, no evidence here for the modernization arguments, a bunch of null results. Rebel remains strong. And then immigrant runs in the opposite direction. So Nan and I both expected to observe immigrants using the singular at higher rates. We see them using it at lower rates. So this is surprising. I should also draw your attention to the party results, both in this slide and the previous slide, right? So what we're doing here is what we see is that being a Whig or Republican means you're no more likely to use the singular compared to the Democrats if we control for being a Confederate. So if we take Confederate out, the party ID matters. Once we put Confederate in, it doesn't matter anymore. So those are the results. So a lot of surprising findings here, right? We found very little evidence in support of the modernization stories. It turns out that this would be consistent with an argument that Wimmer and Feinstein make in a 2010 paper, in an AJS paper, where they also don't find any evidence for the classical modernization stories associated with Gellner and Anderson. It's kind of interesting. Their data are cross-national data at the country level, spanning 2 centuries. Our data are quite different. So I guess there is some precedent that modernization may not be playing the role that we think it is. We're much more confident about the Civil War story in that our data challenge the standard story of the Civil War. We don't see sectional differences pre-Civil War, but after the Civil War, former Confederates are less likely to use the singular. We do find some surprising evidence of geographic uniformity, even in the South, after accounting for those Confederates. And perhaps most interesting, again, a case where my priors were wrong, we find evidence that individuals change how they speak. I was so confident that individuals weren't going to change how they speak. And we actually see the evolution of the speech, the change in the singular usage, and presumably what we're reading, a change in the imagination of sovereignty over time. Our next steps include more data collection. There's still some additional work that has to be done with the GLOBE data. And we are plugging, we're coding some more data on our variables. So right now we don't have any 1800 era post office data. But given the very early stage of this research, we're really eager to hear your questions and comments. And so I think I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Q&A. Thank you so much.
Any House versus Senate differences at all?
No. We have delegates in there as well. So we threw out all the state level representatives, no difference. Okay. We also threw out just Senate, no difference.
Okay. I seem to recall that people have scanned history books, right? The way history books used in classrooms. When did that change? When did we begin to see the reference to move from singular to plural occur in the sort of the teaching of grammar school kids?
The singular and plural in school books, or sort of the narrative about?
In school books.
I don't remember. I think it was around the same time. It might have lagged a little bit. I think generally the studies point to the sort of acceleration at the end of the century.
Okay.
So we were sort of, we took that evidence to be indicative of a cohort replacement effect. And that's not really, that's not only what's going on.
Do you think, so somebody may ask, is there something special or different about members of Congress versus the general population, right? Could it be that members of Congress are more or less likely to change their patterns, their speech patterns?
They're definitely an elite sample compared to the American population. In the early years in our data set, there's a surprising amount of congressmen who don't have an advanced education or a formal education, that those drop off pretty quickly. You might think that someone who chooses to run for Congress and who is selected into Congress already is inclined to think about the United States in different ways than the general population. And so, I think we've been sort of puzzling through how to think about the selection into Congress effect. So right now we don't want to say it's indicative of people in those places, but we're trying to finesse the language to be clear about what the comparison actually is. But yes, we don't think that these are representative of the American population as a whole.
So this is really kind of a technical point, but it could be kind of interesting. You start around 1851 for the reasons that you mentioned with the globe, and your concerns before 1851 is that this, could be that the recorder has the individual who records the debates has a partisan leaning or something like that. Mm-hmm. There was a 2.5 Congress period. You may know this, in which there was an overlap between the Congressional Globe and the Register of Debates, and these were competing publications. One was a Whig and one was a Democrat publication. So you have 5 years, and you can actually, if you wanted to, you could examine how different they might be. And to the extent that there are no differences between, or very limited differences in what's actually reported in those publications, that would be evidence that there really isn't kind of a reporter bias.
Yeah, I think
in which case you could extend back perhaps the data that you have to explore an earlier time period.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. So it's the Register.
The Register.
Do you happen to remember when the
1824 to 1937 is when the Register of Debates is in operation, and the Globe starts in 1833. So you have essentially 4 years there in which they're competing publications.
Okay, I do know at least in the 1830s, the Globe text are summaries. And so I would be wary about using the 1830s era data. I think by the time the summaries start to go away, and we're still sort of worried about partisan bias, that's in the 1840s and the overlap isn't there. But I would be really curious, actually, to check this out. So I'll put it on my to-do list.
Okay, I'll send you a
suggestion.
Email with some more.
That's really cool. Thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, absolutely. From Penelope Ferguson. As part of an explanation for your null effect, did you consider how northern states exerted states' rights to prohibit and limit slavery within their borders, and that southern states demanded enforcement of federal authority in the context of the Fugitive Slave Act?
We have not. We were only in the very early stages of exploring the null results, so we got them like late last week. Right. When I say very preliminary, I mean very and so really, like, this is a great suggestion for us to think about, right? We have not it considered this aspect of sort of states' rights. And so we are really grateful for the suggestion to take it up and sort of think about what this means in an analytical sense for our data. So thank you for it.
Let me ask this: what were some of the, I mean, as you were making your presentation, I was just thinking, man, this is a lot of work, right? This is a lot of work. What sort of data problems did you run into in collecting the data that you're using?
The most frustrating part was the OCR. Initially, our sort of idea to analyze speeches came about because we knew that there were these verbatim transcriptions, and we knew that at least we knew that somebody had already done OCR, and so we came with this assumption that we would be able to download it, do some minimal processing, and just run the searches. Wrong, right? And in the course of doing this kind of data analysis work, I've come across a lot of literature in the digital humanities, which has spent time thinking about and analyzing the degree to which dirty OCR is generating problematic results if scholars are not cleaning it up, right? So there's a surprisingly large amount of scholarship which has not corrected the OCR. And sort of this is like particularly problematic in the digital humanities. And the studies have come to opposite conclusions. So some say that like the error rate of the unprocessed OCR is actually quite low for the types of analyses that the digital humanities scholars are running. Other studies are pointing to really severe effects of the dirty OCR. I would have to say that, if we were doing something more sophisticated than just keyword searches on is, are, and the other two verb pairs, we may have abandoned this project earlier, right? Just the degree to which the Globe and the Record, even the Record, have OCR problems was really daunting. And so, it was a little bit alarming getting these null results on modernization. Alarming also as a scholar of state building, right? These are like the explanations that I hold that are really influential. And so it was really interesting to see. One analysis that we conducted, though, suggests the OCR problems are not particularly worse in the early years. So we've just done a quick and dirty analysis of that. So at least, it was just like kind of back of the envelope analysis of OCR quality. But we are reassured by the fact that it's not like significantly worse. So it would be kind of an interesting problem, I think, for other political scientists. I don't do text as data. I'm not one of these like sophisticated text as data people. And I'm sort of curious to know how much political scientists have had to deal with this problem.
So I was going to ask you then a text as data question. So I remember, 20 years ago, and maybe more since then, Burt Monroe, Arthur Sperling, scholars like that were creating rhetorical ideal points based upon speech, and they were doing the same thing. I'm curious whether, if you could actually get some of those scores, whether there's something rhetorically ideological about the types of people who use one version versus the other, and whether individuals who are changing over time actually change in other fashions as well. I mean, I imagine you can get these rhetorical ideal points by Congress. So you can get the degree to which individuals are changing the way that they are speaking. And presumably, if they're changing the way that they're speaking on this dimension, they're probably changing in other ways as well, right? So for example, if you're moving from the United States are to the United States is, you might be more inclined to favor more expansive federal spending. Some of the same reasons why you took a look at some of the economic variables that you did. So this is just a long way of saying I think there's a lot of additional extensions that you can pursue with this line of inquiry, and some of that other data may still be there. I mean, I remember Burt, 25 years ago maybe, was doing the rhetorical ideal points for the most recent Congress, and it was a slow process at the time. But the technology has changed so much since then. Right. It wouldn't surprise me. And maybe I think you said Adam Ramey at one point in here. I think Adam's done that too. Um, there's other stuff out there that you can use and extend the stuff, the work that you're doing.
Yeah. My RA, who's been doing a lot of the sort of implementation in R with my supervision, he's really eager to dive deep. He's like, there's so much here that you guys are not exploring. One thing at a time for a paper. But yes, like I actually have a question for you. So is there, I'm not an Americanist, right? So I was thinking about what the meaning of ideology in this time period. And sort of I had read somewhere that you can't really take the vote view system of ideological scores and sort of treat them unproblematically in the 19th century. Is there any other way that scholars in American have thought about measuring ideology that sort of makes sense for this time period over, 6-7 decades?
Probably not.
Okay.
There are just so many. So you do want to be careful. So if you start in 1851, there's a general belief that, say between 1851 and 1877 or thereabouts, the first dimension, the first major dimension of ideology per nominate is something related to race, right? It starts as slavery, then it becomes, Civil War reconstruction. After 1877, it becomes more of a basic left-right. Do you favor more or less, federal spending, a bigger or smaller federal government? Mm-hmm. So after 1877, I think you're in pretty good shape for thinking that the first dimension is kind of capturing the same thing through the end of the time period you have. But that is one problematic feature, because you start in 1851 and the ideological world is a little bit different for the first 25 years of the period that you're analyzing.
Right.
How much difference is there between Southern members who were Confederates and Southern members who were not? If you simply look at those 11 states and focus on, those individuals who were members of Congress who had some role in the Confederacy versus those who didn't, is there much of a difference
between those two groups as opposed to between the North?
Yeah. So throw out the North and just look within the South at those who have a Confederate background and those who don't.
Yeah, I want to say that there is a difference. I don't have a plot to show you.
Or use use the North as your baseline category, right? And then have two groups of Southerners.
Yeah.
Some of those Southerners are going to be, former slaves during Reconstruction, right? You're going to have some that are carpetbaggers from the North, right?
Yeah. I think we did try to code redeemers versus non-redeemers, right? The non-redeemers, including the carpetbaggers. And I think the problem there is that we don't have enough data points to be confident about the effect of the redeemers. So that's part of the reason why we didn't present it. So like we sort of saw this powerful effect, and then we looked and there was like only a handful of speeches from these guys. The numbers were sub 20, I think, for the number of individuals. And one guy was making like 10 speeches. Anyway, so basically the N was very low for that group. And so we didn't slice it. We didn't want to slice it for this presentation. There's a few other things that I think Tilmit, the RA, can do to help us extract more more true positives in US singular or plural. It's the OCR is really complicating it. So we think we're actually leaving a bunch of data behind. So we're trying to pull in more data to really get at some of these finer distinctions.
How should we think about the fact that the decision to make a speech is not random, within the Congress? Some people are more loquacious than others, right? Some people also want to speak on topics that would not touch on is versus are.
Right. So I think people who make a speech feel particularly strongly about an issue, right, or represent a constituency for which that issue is very important, which makes sense, right? Like states' rights were a big issue, and so as well as the impact of the Reconstruction on everyday life for Southerners. And so it's not surprising that we might see lots of speeches in this time period, especially afterward, being spoken by these Confederates, or former Confederates, I should say. I guess the question then becomes like, what about all the silent people in Congress, right? On the other hand, you know, there are, like, just reading these speeches, there are a lot of mundane things that they speak about when the United States is a subject. So there was like one particularly long exchange where they were considering sort of contractual obligations of the United States that had nothing to do with sort of states' rights issues or sectional considerations or anything like that. There's a lot of speech about the United States with respect to other countries, which I think would not be related to sort of characteristics, again, sort of the states' rights issues. So I think what we don't know right now is what proportion of speech covers topics related to, states' rights issues, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. So we're leaving all that content behind. So like when Tillman is saying, like, there's more information here, the only thing that's stopping us from analyzing it is the work of dealing with the bad OCR. We haven't yet figured out how to do that. And so I think we'd like to do it. And I think the question is sort of where the biggest bang for the buck would be right now.
Would you generate this quantitative data the same way in order to recognize these patterns if it were a different comparison between social statuses?
So if we were comparing, say, working class versus upper class, I would worry about Congress being an appropriate lens into class, right? Given that these are elite members of society, a substantial number of them are lawyers, and the sort of percentage of congressmen with working class backgrounds, or sort of not working class, that's sort of with low levels of education, that as they drop off, right? So this is I think not an appropriate sample. I think that the way to think about the social status, or at least in terms of class, would be to find speech, like text, that sort of reflects the patterns or is accessible to all Americans. Newspapers have been analyzed as and the justification has been that like all classes of Americans can read newspapers, conditional on being literate. This is one of the critiques of the Supreme Court analysis. I do know that there's been efforts to look at book collections. So like there are digital collections of books, and so digital humanities scholars have gone through. Again, there you have to make an assumption about sort of reading habits and sort of who these books are written for that to be a lens into different social statuses. But of course, class is not the only social status that's relevant. And so I would, based on the type of division, I would then look to different sets of data.
Okay, so we'll thank Melissa for presentation. I'll give her a hand here myself. I know I found it really interesting. I think this is a really cool project.